The radiator in my Brooklyn apartment clanked with a rhythmic, metallic stutter that felt like a failing pulse in the throat of the building, a dying heat trying to fight off the predatory chill of December. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the rough fibers of the thrifted rug biting into my shins, while the blue light of my laptop screen washed over my face, highlighting the high, sharp angles of my cheekbones and the deep, midnight espresso glow of my skin. I was deep into a Python script, my mind lost in a forest of Boolean logic and stochastic modeling, trying to clean a massive dataset of irregular financial transactions that refused to correlate. The hum of the refrigerator 3 rooms away was a physical weight, a droning reminder of the profound vacuum of sound that occupied my life. I adjusted my silk head wrap, the fabric smooth and cool against my hairline, and reached for a mug of cocoa that had long since surrendered its warmth to the room. The liquid was thick, cloyingly sweet, and left a film of cold fat against the roof of my mouth that made me grimace. Outside the window, Brooklyn was being erased by a relentless curtain of white, the snow muffling the usual sirens and screams of a city until everything felt subterranean. It was Christmas Eve, the clock on my taskbar ticking toward 12, and I was exactly where I had been for the last 3 years, orbiting the center of a self-imposed void. My phone lay face down on the scarred wood of the coffee table, a black rectangle of silence that I refused to touch. I had scrubbed my notifications clean hours ago, unable to stomach the digital noise of family gatherings or the curated joy of former colleagues who had eventually stopped reaching out. My isolation wasn't an accident. It was a fortress I had built brick by brick after the sudden, violent erasure of my parents in a rainy pileup on the I-95 5 years ago. I had learned that people were variables you couldn't control, outliers that skewed the mean, and left you with nothing but a devastating margin of error. It was a sterile existence. It was a secure cage. It was the only thing I could trust. The sudden, violent percussion of 3 sharp knocks against my front door didn't just break the silence. It shattered it like a hammer hitting frozen glass. My heart didn't just beat. It lunged against my ribs, a trapped bird fluttering in a cage of bone, and the adrenaline hit my bloodstream with a metallic tang that tasted like copper pennies at the back of my throat. I didn't move for 10 seconds. My breath held until my lungs burned, wondering if the isolation had finally fractured my psyche into auditory hallucinations. No one knocked on my door at midnight, especially not with that kind of rhythmic, heavy authority that suggested the wood owed them entry. Then it came again, more insistent, a heavy thud of knuckles that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my bare feet. I set the laptop aside, the movement slow and jerky, and stood up, the joints in my knees popping with a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden quiet. I crept toward the door, the hardwood floor cold and unyielding, my shadows stretching long and thin against the hallway wall. Through the fisheye lens of the peephole, the world was distorted into a curved, surreal landscape. A man stood there, framed by the dim, flickering yellow light of the hallway, his presence so massive he seemed to swallow the surrounding air. He was wearing a charcoal overcoat that looked heavy enough to stop a bullet, the shoulders dusted with a fine powder of snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds. His face was a map of sharp, ancestral lines, high, architectural cheekbones, a blade-straight nose, and eyes so dark they looked like ink drops in water. He stood with a terrifyingly still posture, a coiled energy that reminded me of a predator waiting for the wind to shift. My voice was a dry rasp when I finally spoke, the sound of it unfamiliar even to me. "Who is it?" I called out, my hand hovering inches from the deadbolt. "My name is Junho Park," a voice replied, the tone deep and resonant, carrying a faint, melodic cadence of soul softened by years of New York grit. "I need to speak with you regarding your neighbor, Mrs. Calibracy." The mention of the name acted like a physical key, turning the lock of my caution just enough to let a sliver of concern leak through. Mrs. Calibracy was a tiny, iron-willed Italian woman who had spent the last 3 Christmases trying to bribe me into her apartment with the scent of baked ziti and the warmth of a grandmotherly persistent pity. She was the only person in this zip code who looked at my solitude and saw a wound instead of a choice, and the thought of her in distress caused a tightening in my chest that felt like a physical ligature. "Is she hurt? Is she okay?" I asked, my fingers finally finding the cold metal of the chain lock. Please, open the door, Junho said, and though there was no desperation in his voice, there was a gravity to it that pulled at my center of gravity. I promise I am not here to cause you harm, but the hallway is no place for this conversation, and I'd rather not discuss Mrs. Calibrese's safety through 3 inches of oak. My internal survival algorithms were screaming, flashing red alerts about the danger of opening the door to a man who looked like he belonged in a high-stakes boardroom or a high-profile crime scene. But the thought of the old woman lying alone on a kitchen floor overrode the logic of my fear. I slid the chain, turned the deadbolt with a heavy thwack, and opened the door just wide enough to see him clearly. He was devastating. Up close, the air around him smelled of expensive sandalwood, cold ozone, and the faint, bitter scent of gun oil. His eyes scanned me with an intensity that felt like a physical touch, taking in my flannel pajamas, the slight tremor in my hands, and the defiant set of my jaw. Amara Vance, he said, his voice dropping an octave as he spoke my name, turning it into something weighty and significant. The fact that he knew who I was sent a fresh jolt of electricity down my spine, a cold, hollow ache of realization. Yes, I replied, trying to steady my breathing. What has happened to her? A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a flicker of appreciation for the way I held my ground despite the visible shaking of my fingertips. She is perfectly safe, spending the holiday with her son in New Jersey, but she contacted me because she was worried about the woman who lives in 4B, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. She was worried about you being alone tonight, and she was right to be. The kindness behind that statement was a blunt force trauma to my emotional defenses. Mrs. Calibrese, whom I had rebuffed with a dozen polite, frozen smiles, had reached out to a man who looked like death in a bespoke coat just to ensure I wasn't rotting in my own silence. I'm fine, I managed to say, though the word felt like a lie that was too thin to cover the truth. You shouldn't have come all this way just to deliver a message for my neighbor. I didn't come just to deliver a message, Junho said, and his expression shifted, the warmth vanishing to reveal something metallic and hard beneath the surface. I came because you are currently the center of a very dangerous Venn diagram, and you are the only one who doesn't realize the perimeter has been breached. Behind him, through the hallway window, I could see the snow falling in silent, beautiful indifference to the threat he was implying. Every instinct I possessed told me to slam the door and call the authorities, to retreat back into the safety of my spreadsheets and my cold cocoa. But as I looked at him, I realized the authorities couldn't help me against whatever world he represented. I stepped back, the movement purely instinctive, and gestured for him to enter. 5 minutes, I said, the words sharp and punchy. Then you leave. He crossed the threshold with a silent, feline grace, his presence immediately making my living room feel like a dollhouse. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of the rug, his eyes cataloging the space with a clinical efficiency, the stacks of technical manuals, the single plate in the sink, the way I had positioned my desk to face the door. He was building a profile of me in real time, stripping away my privacy with a single, sweeping glance. You live a very contained life, Amara, he noted, his voice reflecting the same technical precision I used in my data analysis. It's a life built on the assumption that if you don't touch the world, it won't touch you back. But that's a statistical impossibility. What danger are you talking about? I asked, leaning against the kitchen counter, my fingers gripping the edge of the granite until the stone felt like it might crumble. He turned to me, and for the first time, I saw the weariness in his eyes, a deep-seated exhaustion that spoke of decades spent navigating a world of shadows. My family has operated in Brooklyn for a long time, he said, his tone matter-of-fact. Some call us the Soul Syndicate, others use less polite terms, but we provide a certain level of equilibrium to the neighborhood. One of my rivals, a man named Viktor Volkov, has decided that the best way to disrupt that equilibrium is to target the civilians in my protected buildings. He reached into his coat, and I tensed, my heart rate spiking into a tachycardic rhythm. He pulled out a sleek, black smartphone and tapped the screen, holding it out so I could see the image. It was a high-resolution photo of my building's entrance, taken from across the street. A black sedan with tinted windows sat idling at the curb, its exhaust a white plume in the freezing air. That car has been there for 6 hours, Junho said. There are 3 men inside. They aren't watching the building. They're watching the lights in your window. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick to breathe, like I was trying to inhale water. Why me? I don't know this, Victor. I don't know you. I don't know anything about your world, I whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of panicked logic. Because you are an outlier, he replied, stepping closer until I could see the faint, silver threading at his temples. You are isolated. You have no family nearby, no partner, no one who would notice if you went missing for 48 hours. To a man like Victor, you aren't a person. You are a low-risk, high-reward message to be sent to me. He is trying to prove I cannot protect my own. I shook my head, my mind racing through data points, trying to find an exit strategy that didn't involve the man standing in my kitchen. Call the police, I said, though I already knew the answer. The police are a lagging indicator, Junho said, his voice flat. By the time they arrive to investigate a broken door, the data they're collecting is your blood on the floor. Victor owns enough of the precinct to ensure they'd take the long way around anyway. He pocketed the phone and looked at me with an intensity that made the hair on my arm stand up. I am here to offer you a choice. You can stay here and hope my men can stop them before they reach the 4th floor, or you can come with me to a location where I can personally guarantee your safety. I let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh that sounded like a sob. You want me to go with a Mafia boss to a secondary location? That is the textbook definition of a bad decision. I am offering you the only variable that leads to your survival, he countered. You have my word as a park that no harm will come to you in my home. You will have total autonomy. I just need to keep you off the grid until I can remove Victor from the equation. For how long? I asked, the internal physiological response to his proximity. The thrum of adrenaline in my fingertips, the tightening of my chest, becoming impossible to ignore. A week, perhaps less, he said. I am already moving to liquidate his assets. He studied my face, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. I know you are terrified. I know you think I am the devil. But I am the devil you know, and I am the one Mrs. Calabresi trusts. I looked around my apartment, the safe, suffocating space I had curated so carefully. I thought about the car outside, the men waiting in the cold for the lights to go out. My mother used to say that sometimes the only way out of a fire is to run through it. I'll go, I said, the words feeling like a betrayal of my own rules. But I need guarantees. I need my laptop, I need to be able to work, and I need to know I can leave the second the threat is neutralized. Your conditions are accepted, he said, the relief in his voice subtle but present. Pack a bag. You have 10 minutes before the sedan decides to move. I retreated to my bedroom, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pull my duffel bag from the closet. I shoved in sweaters, jeans, my chargers, and my parents' old leather-bound photo album, the only object that still held the faint, lingering scent of my mother's perfume, a mix of vanilla and old paper. When I returned to the living room, Junho was waiting by the door, his eyes fixed on the window. He took my bag without a word, his fingers brushing mine. The contact was electric, a sudden, searing heat that made my skin prickle. Ready? He asked.
No, irraplia.
Let's go. We descended the stairs in a tense, tactical silence, Junho keeping his body between me and the banister, his hand never far from the lapel of his coat. Outside, the air was a frozen blade that sliced into my lungs, the scent of snow and wet concrete overwhelming. The black sedan was still there, a dark predator idling in the shadows, but as we reached a waiting silver SUV, 2 men in long coats stepped out from behind a brick wall, their hands deep in their pockets. They were Junho's men, a silent perimeter that made the sedan hesitate just long enough for us to slide into the back seat. The interior of the SUV was a sensory shift, heated leather that felt like velvet, the soft glow of amber ambient lighting, and the low, muffled hum of a high-performance engine. This is Marco, my head of security, Junho said, gesturing to the broad-shouldered man behind the wheel whose face was bisected by a jagged scar. We pulled away from the curb, and through the rear window, I saw the black sedan swing out to follow us, its headlights like the eyes of a wolf. They're following, I said, my voice thin. They are trying, Junho replied, his hand finding mine in the darkness. They will fail. His grip was warm and steady, a grounding force in a world that had suddenly lost its axis. The drive took us through the glittering, vertical labyrinth of Manhattan, away from the familiar grime of my neighborhood and into the rarefied air of the Upper East Side. We stopped at a glass and steel monolith that seemed to pierce the low, snowy clouds. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and silent, expensive security, and as we stepped into a private elevator, the ascent made my ears pop. We reached the 60th floor, and the doors opened directly into a space that defied my understanding of the word apartment. The penthouse was a panoramic masterpiece of glass and shadow, the Manhattan skyline spread out like a circuit board of light and geometry beneath our feet. It was massive, open concept, and smelled of cedar and high-end air filtration. Despite the opulence, there were signs of a real human life. Shelves packed with historical biographies, a collection of antique fountain pens, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged to a Michelin star chef. "This is your home for the next few days," Junho said, setting my bag down on a low, slate-gray sofa. I wandered to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city below looking like a toy set. From this height, the danger felt distant, an abstract concept that didn't belong in a room this beautiful. But when I saw my reflection in the glass, I saw the truth. A 25-year-old woman with fear etched into her eyes, caught in the gravity of a man whose life was built on the very violence she was running from. Junho appeared at my elbow, holding a delicate porcelain cup of tea. "Chamomile and honey," he said, "for the nerves." I took it, the warmth of the ceramic seeping into my palms. "Why are you really doing this?" I asked, looking at him through the steam. "You could have just sent your guards to my building." "I chose to bring you here because I've been alone on Christmas for longer than I care to admit," he confessed, the honesty in his voice raw and unexpected. "My work creates a vacuum where people should be. When Mrs. Calabresi called, I saw a chance to do something right and, perhaps, a chance to not spend the night talking to the walls." The vulnerability in his admission made my chest ache. "You're an opportunist," I said. "I am a man who recognizes a rare variable when I see one," he corrected. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of toasted sesame oil and garlic drifting through the penthouse. I had slept in a bed that felt like a cloud, wrapped in Egyptian cotton that was smoother than my own skin. I found Junho in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms dusted with light hair, expertly maneuvering a wok. He was making manduguk, dumpling soup. "It is a tradition for the new year, but I thought we could use the luck today," he said, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. He moved with a technical veracity that fascinated me. He wasn't just cooking, he was executing a sequence with the same precision I used for SQL queries. He spoke about the balance of the broth, the importance of the ratio between pork and ginger in the filling, and the exact temperature needed to achieve the perfect texture. I sat at the marble island, watching him, feeling a strange, domestic peace settle over me. Marco entered the room, his expression grim, holding a tablet. "There was an incident at the Red Hook warehouse," he said. "Victor's men tried to push the line." "How many?" Junho asked, his voice instantly turning back to ice. "3 of ours injured, 5 of theirs neutralized. But they're looking for the girl. They know she isn't at the apartment." Junho's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping in his cheek. "Then we accelerate the timeline. Marco, get the Westchester estate ready. We move her there tonight. It's a fortress." He turned to me, his eyes searching.
I'm sorry, Emare.
"This is getting more complicated than I promised." "I trust you," I said, and the realization of that truth was more terrifying than Viktor Volkov could ever be. I had spent years building walls, and in 24 hours, this man had walked through them as if they were made of smoke. The move to the estate in Westchester was a blur of high-speed transit and tactical maneuvering. The house was a sprawling stone manor surrounded by acres of forest and a 12-foot wrought iron fence. It was a golden cage, reinforced with bulletproof glass and manned by a small army of silent professionals. Junho spent most of the day in a basement command center, leaving me to wander the library and try to focus on my data analysis. But the numbers wouldn't align. My mind kept drifting to the scar on Junho's shoulder I'd glimpsed that morning, a jagged reminder of a life I could barely imagine. That evening, he found me in the library, staring at a photo of his parents. They were killed when I was young, he said, standing close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, by a man who wanted what we had. I spent the next decade ensuring no one could ever do that again. But in the process, I became a man who is everything and nothing. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, a touch that felt like a prayer.
You make me want to find a middle ground, Amara.
I leaned into his hand, the visceral internal focus of the moment, the frantic thrum of my heart, the way my skin seemed to reach for his, overwhelming my logic. I love you, I whispered, the words a leap of faith into a dark abyss. He didn't answer with words. He kissed me, a deep, desperate collision that tasted of honey and salt. It was a promise and a warning all at once. The peace was shattered 2 nights later. I had insisted on going back to my apartment to retrieve a hard drive containing encrypted client data that I couldn't access remotely, a technical necessity that I convinced Junho was vital. He had sent me with 4 guards, but Viktor Volkov was more patient than we anticipated. They hit us in the alleyway, a coordinated strike of flashbangs and silenced weapons. I remember the smell of magnesium and the sudden, crushing weight of a hand over my mouth. I was shoved into a van, my wrists bound with zip ties that bit into my flesh, my head covered with a rough burlap sack that smelled of old grain and dust. The fear was a cold, physiological takeover, my lungs seizing, my vision tunneling into a pinpoint of white light. I was taken to a derelict warehouse on the docks, the sound of the freezing Atlantic slapping against the pilings a rhythmic funeral dirge. Victor was there, a man with eyes like polished flint and a voice that sounded like gravel grinding in a tin can. You are the lever, he said, his hand stroking my hair with a sickening gentleness. The lever that will break Junho Park. He called Junho, giving him an hour to arrive alone, or I would be fed to the harbor. I sat in a metal chair, the cold from the concrete floor leaching into my bones, and I prayed. Not for my life, but for Junho to be the man I thought he was. When Junho arrived, he didn't come with an army. He came with a silence that was more terrifying than 1,000 guns. He walked into the warehouse with his hands raised, his eyes fixed on mine, a dark, burning sun in the center of the room. Let her go, Victor, he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. You want the territory?
Take it.
You want the accounts? They're yours. Just let her walk, Victor laughed, a jagged sound that echoed off the corrugated steel walls. I want you dead, Junho. And I want her to see it, but Junho wasn't surrender. He was a distraction. The smoke canisters hit a second later, a blinding gray wall that swallowed the room. In the chaos, I felt a hand on my arm, Junho. He cut my ties with a quick flick of a blade and shoved me behind a crate. The firefight was short, sharp, and brutal. When the smoke cleared, Victor's men were down, and Junho stood over Victor with a gun pressed to his temple. Your choice, Samara, Junho said, his chest heaving, blood from a graze on his arm dripping onto the floor. Does he live? I looked at the man who had stolen my breath and realized that more blood wouldn't wash away the fear. Let him go to the feds, I said. Don't let him turn you into a ghost, Junho nodded, the tension in his shoulders finally breaking. 3 months later, I was standing in a vineyard in Tuscany, the air warm and smelling of ripening grapes and ancient earth. The isolation I had cherished for years was a distant memory, a skin I had shed to reveal the woman underneath. Junho walked up behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his presence a constant, grounding warmth. We had left the shadows of Brooklyn for a while, letting the world heal the jagged edges of our meeting. He had started the process of legitimizing his businesses, turning the Soul Syndicate into a venture capital firm that focused on community development, a move that required more data analysis than I had ever imagined. I looked at the sunset, the sky a riot of orange and purple, and I realized that I wasn't safe because of a fortress or a guard. I was safe because I had finally allowed someone to see me. I had spent my life calculating risks, trying to minimize the margin of error, but I had learned that the only data point that truly mattered was the one that couldn't be quantified. Sometimes you have to let the world in, even if it brings the cold. Because without the cold, you can't feel the heat of a hand in yours. I leaned back into him. The hum of the refrigerator in Brooklyn a million miles away, replaced by the rhythmic, living pulse of the man who had knocked on my door and saved my life.
Merry Christmas, Yunhu, he whispered.
Every day is a gift, he replied. And for the first time in 5 years, I believed it.